ranking the 2024 class among the rookie classes of the last 10 years. That is what we're going to do on this edition of RotoViz OT. The good news is you don't have to rank them. Shawn Siegele has already gone and done that. We are having a sneak peek behind the scenes at an article that is going to be published on rotoviz.com over probably the next 24 hours, maybe even by the time you're listening to this, may already have been published. But I think it's a fun concept to look back, see how some of the other classes have done in the past. Obviously, there's always a lot of talk about, for example, the 2014 wide receiver class that came in with Odell Beckham, Mike Evans, and a lot more involved in that helped, fuel fantasy scoring for many, many years following that. But now Shawn has ranked the other 10 years looking back. So we are going to focus on the 2024 class, and then we're going to jump to some other ones to focus in as well. But we may even get to Shawn's number one pick, which is the 2017 class. So we may sneak our way back to that, Shawn, as we work through it. This is obviously something that you've been working on over the last period of time. I know a lot of work goes into pieces like this. So how are you feeling as we get ready to dive in? Are you confident in these rankings?
Pretty confident. It was fun, Colm, to go back and look at the last decade, to think about it through a dynasty lens. One of the reasons that this exercise sort of popped to mind was working through the dynasty rankings. We'll have new updates there for all of the subscribers soon. Colm, we joked about some of the strengths and weaknesses of week 10 in going through all of the FFPC RotoViz Triflex leagues that were involved in. That was a good week for that group, and it's been a very good season for our perpetual reloaded squads, even though the vast majority of them had Rashee Rice. We're seeing the power of constantly building and moving those teams toward empire status. But Colm, one of the things that I then wanted to do was rank or redraft the 2024 class. I thought maybe I'll do this in the context of a couple. How did the last 2 or 3 classes look? And then, you're just thinking about it. Like, well, why don't we just do 10, right? Why don't we do a full decade and see where these guys end up? So one other thing I did include were players who might not have even been drafted in the original rookie draft, guys who came out of nowhere. Certainly in the 2023 class, you have someone like Puka Nacua. Now, it's really interesting to look back at some of these classes. The 2023 class, certainly one of those that had some strengths and weaknesses, but with the big time QBs at the top was considered to have pretty decent depth. Just a year later, that class fits in the middle of the pack. We have a ton of risers in that class. We now have a class that looks very good at the top at the running back position, but those QBs are falling, including CJ Stroud, who falls out of the top 6 at this point with his struggles in 2024, where he's not even really a viable starting QB in regular formats. Now, this is based on super flex scoring, but one of the things you would obviously just do if you're playing regular dynasty is just more or less to remove the quarterbacks completely, right? That part of it is pretty easy. It's one of the reasons people do play super flex, simply because it's more fun to have all 4 positions relevant. But Colm, the thing that I think most listeners will be interested in off the top is where we are with the current rookie class in this moment as we're about to start week 11. Where does 2024 fit, and who do you think should be number 1?
So these are always interesting because even and just to answer your question, you've slotted in at number 3, Shawn. So it's a high ranking so far. But even when we go as far as number 10, and we look back historically at some of the players that were in the 2015 class, Todd Gurley's in there, Stephon Diggs. But the problem with some of these teams is, the length of time. So there was a lot of points, but the length of time that those guys, spent in the league obviously detracts from that. So we don't have that information yet on the 2024 class. We're hoping they're all going to be there for a long, long time. But when we look, Shawn, we're going to go through some of these names. We're not going to go through every single one, but we'll pick out the key ones that are of interest. But there's 2 names here, and there's actually a third name that I really think that could be pushing to be in that slot. So the 101, Shawn, has in as Jayden Daniels, the 102 Brock Bowers, the 103 Malik Neighbors. And I can see a case for Bowers there, but obviously the super flex, and this is set up for tight end premium as well, I believe, Shawn, correct? Yeah. So when we look at it, like Bowers being pushed up there in the tight end premium formats, I think it's very fair. But Malik Neighbors, if he hadn't had his time out with the concussion, and obviously if he didn't have Daniel Jones as quarterback, we could have situations where he's even higher than the third spot. So I think they're all ranked fairly. And Superflex, the addition of having that high-end quarterback, I think that Daniels is fair in the spot that you have him. Being biased, I'm going to say, Shawn, that Brock Bowers should be the 101. We should be pushing him just slightly ahead and putting him there over Daniels. But the other advantage I think Daniels gets in this class is that he has elevated himself as the clear quarterback in this class at this particular point through the 10 weeks of the season, that there's not really a competition for the QB1. So I think that adds a little bit of value for him as well from that perspective. And I think for people who are playing in leagues that are, maybe like I know the leagues that I play in that I'm dealing with tight ends. A lot of people are just not as interested in the tight end position as maybe we are, or if you're playing tight end premium and see that the advantage that position can give. So I think that, Brock Bowers probably isn't making it to the 101 as consensus. So you're in the right spot here with Daniels.
Well, one of the reasons that the dynasty teams are doing well is that they have that cluster of elite tight ends. One of the reasons the redraft FFPC teams are doing well is they have that cluster of tight ends. I think if you are discounting tight end, you're giving away not only a key strength, but one that's actually pretty easy to achieve for some of the reasons you mentioned. A lot of people are ignoring that position. Colm, one of the reasons that I like the 2024 class is that right now, even with some of the disappointments, it does look to me like it's going to be fairly deep. However, there's probably the likelihood that it will slide as opposed to rising. One of the things that makes it a little bit difficult for some of these older classes is that we know how things turn out, which we don't really have for 2024. We have a lot of guys here who still are very tantalizing. Maybe they've gotten off to slow starts, but you were expecting them to really make a move. Someone who has been kind of trendy at points in Blake Corum doesn't even make the first two rounds, which is what I have focused on in these drafts. By contrast, that class that ranked dead last, which, as you mentioned, did have that really interesting combination of players at the top in Todd Gurley, Stephon Diggs, Melvin Gordon, David Johnson. Amari Cooper is number 5. Tyler Lockett, who didn't have the fastest of starts, but has been good for a decade now, is the 106. The problem comes in is that Jameis Winston is the 107. The complete remainder of that group, the last 18 guys, were more or less irrelevant for fantasy. We wouldn't have known that in the middle of the 2015 season. It's possible that some of these younger classes will go that route, but it's also possible that we will see the top players rise even further. Right now, I have Marvin Harrison down at the 106. Obviously, a lot of people had him, and I believe his ADP was at the 102. Harrison hasn't been good, and yet he's played well enough that if you had him at the 102 originally, you're probably not moving him down to 106. And you're also probably looking at this and saying, if Caleb Williams is the 108, if quarterbacks like J.J. McCarthy and Michael Penix, who sort of round the group out and haven't gotten a chance to play, are buried deep in the second round, if you have players like Tyrone Tracy and Bucky Irving, who have gotten off to absolutely fantastic starts, if you have them in the second round, if you have Jonathan Brooks, who again hasn't had a chance to show anything yet, if you have him in the second round, that depth, along with what looks like will be an incredible top end. We talked about the top 5 or 6 guys in this class potentially being generational prospects. And mostly what we have gotten is reason for enthusiasm, right? Drake Maye, the 104, he has looked very, very good. And then Brian Thomas is a player that I have moved ahead of Harrison here because, unlike Harrison, you can see the physical dynamism in the way that Thomas plays, and that has manifested in fantasy points, even within the context of the Jacksonville Jaguars offense that's been a train wreck. I really like the way this class looks going forward, and if someone like a Caleb Williams can turn it around, then the 2024 class could push for number one, which again, this was a very highly thought of and well-marketed class from a dynasty perspective for a long time. Colm, when you look at these rankings here and where I have Brooks 201, Tracy 202, Irving 203, there are a couple of questions that pop to mind. First of all, especially when you consider the long delay in his debut and the Chuba Hubbard extension, it was very questionable to me that I didn't simply move Tracy and Irving ahead of him immediately. He would now have to play fantastic football to really earn the same type of level that they have already demonstrated, even with the difference in perception coming in, even with the difference in draft status. So how do you order those three backs? And then also, do you prefer the backs over controversial receivers that I have ranked just ahead of them in Worthy, Adunze, Coleman, and McConkey, all of whom have flashed at times, but all of whom still pretty clearly have some red flags?
I think it's pairing those pretty much all together in a tier. For long-term listeners or short-term listeners of the show, they'll know that in Dynasty, I tend to have a strong bias towards the receiver position over the running backs. But those guys, particularly in PPR formats, Irvin and Tracy have shown what they can do in the receiving game, more so maybe on the Tracy side. But what they have been able to do in their short time in the NFL, even though there's been competition around them, and they've both been kind of dealing with different injury issues throughout the course of the season. And obviously Brooks has missed up to now with a serious injury that he got before the NFL draft. But I think that they're all in a tier, Shawn. That's Adunze, Worthy, Coleman, and McConkey. And even with any bias that we have for Worthy coming into the season, it has not played out as we would have liked. There's a different universe and a different scenario where that season looks very different with just, 2 or 3 more receptions based on some of the stuff we talked about earlier in the week with Mahomes deep passing, but there has also been issues on his side. The Adunze situation could look vastly different if the Bears situation wasn't as dire as it has currently been to start the year. So maybe some of that is the positives, of how the running backs are playing, and it's maybe just painting that picture a bit too much for us. But I think that they would all be in a set tier, those particular 7 names. At this point, I would have Worthy and Adunze above the running backs, but I think I would slot all 3 of those running backs then and at the Keon Coleman, Lad McConkey split at the 111 there, and that's only moving them up ahead of Lad McConkey, so it's pretty much where you have them. The other player that I can see potentially moving up in this and tight end premium formats is Jatavion Sanders, who is the second to last pick in that second round. We've seen some more usage for him over the last couple of weeks, and then we've seen him get into the end zone this past week, and I think that we could see him go above the likes of Wright, Ray Davis, Leggett. Like, I think he could become a more important part of that offense than Leggett pretty quickly moving forward. So I could see him sliding up in the second round. But again, when we're looking at the picture that we have now versus the picture that we have, in 12 months from now, James Conner moving forward, he's playing fantastic at the moment. But what is it, the situation there in Arizona for him? That obviously changes everything for Trey Benson. Similarly, if Raheem Mostert was not in Miami, that opens up the door a little bit for Wright. But there's also going to be players that are drafted to come into those situations as well. The player, Shawn, that I was interested to ask you about, Drake Maye is at the 104, Bo Nix is at the 107. They have obviously come in and the limited amount of time that Maye has played, I've been very impressed. I think Bo Nix is getting better every single week. And then JJ McCarthy drops down to the 204. Looking at how the quarterbacks have kind of moved around over the last 10 weeks, McCarthy, and he had a cleanup procedure done this week, which apparently there's no concern over, but is always a little bit concerning when things happen. How are you seeing this picture evolving moving forward? I'm interested with the Maye being above Nix. Is that just partially because of the expectation of both of those guys coming into the NFL, or how are you separating Maye and Nix in this situation?
Yeah, I think you still have to give the edge to the younger player who was drafted earlier, who has the better arm, and who is also demonstrating a ton of mobility, is going to add rushing value to the team. Now, the big difference here is that Nix probably is in a better long-term situation with the better coaching staff. And the reason that both of those guys move ahead of Caleb Williams, and I think that the Nix versus Williams, for some people, even though Williams has been so bad that he's already gotten coaches fired, because of his status entering the league, because of his youth, because of the hybrid ability that he brings as well, I think it's fair, any criticism that would be an overreaction. I mean, one of the problems that we have here is that we're not that far from Caleb Williams dropping into the middle of the second round, right? You can't continue to play like he's played and start to create these questions of whether or not you're even going to be the future starter in Chicago and maintain that status. I think that he'll turn it around. At the same time, I think the very highest end outcome is probably now off the table, because a truly generational prospect would have overcome the situation that he was in, especially with those receivers, especially with the mobility. The thing that's happened to this point is the mobility has not translated into a willingness or capability to overcome the original play. As much as he's extended some of these plays, and with the receivers that he has, once you extended that play, go ahead and hit your guy, move the ball. The reason that I think we can so confidently put Nix at the 107 and have him only trailing guys like a Brian Thomas and Marvin Harrison, players that we expect to be really good for a decade, is because he's demonstrated the hybrid part of the equation so clearly. So you think about how quarterbacks are scoring, how he's scoring in 2024, what the necessity is. You think about the excitement, for example, around a Will Levis. Well, one of the things that Nix has demonstrated very clearly is that he is much more dynamic than Will Levis as a mover. He has much better pocket awareness. And so even if there are future hiccups as a passer, his ability to neutralize sacks and generate rushing yardage, that already makes him a long-term QB1 for you in redraft formats. Certainly in a super flex format, he's one of your two starting QBs fairly straightforwardly. When he gives you that, and then we see the growth as a passer, we think about the amount of space that Sean Payton often creates. We think about how easy Payton makes this offense. He's not going to be a Drew Brees, and yet he's going to be more mobile than Brees was. He's going to add that to the fantasy scoring calculation. I certainly wouldn't be surprised if a couple of years from now he's moved up in the rankings, simply because I think he's less likely to stumble than some of the guys ahead of him.
Yeah, and I think that this year's rookie quarterback class could be one that, there is development over the next 18 months, and we see that picture of where they are at the moment be pushed higher up in this round as well. When we look at 2023, you have CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson. For different reasons, that picture has changed a lot over those opening 10 weeks of the season. And while when we talked about the running backs of this year's class, and for different reasons where they are ranked, Shawn, you have 7 running backs in the first 2 rounds, but they're all in the first 2 rounds, or all in round 2 of 2024. When we look at 2023, we start off with 3 in the first round, 3 in the first picks. It is Bijan Robinson, Devin Achane, and then Jahmyr Gibbs. A lot of talent at that front end. It is ranked as the number 5 class over those last 10. But, when we started the draft process last season, Puka Nacua wasn't the wide receiver 1 in that class. He is now the 104 in your rankings here. We have Jayden Reed, Zay Flowers, Rashee Rice, you mentioned a moment ago. JSN obviously had a monster game the last time we seen him in the NFL. He's the 110 after Sam Laporta and CJ Stroud. Josh Downs, Tank Dell, Jordan Addison, Tucker Kraft has really step forward in 2024. You've Chase Brown, then the two quarterbacks in Richardson and Bryce Young. Tank Bigsby, Cedric Tillman has taken a major step forward this season. Tyjae Spears looked good in week 10, working back. Quentin Johnson is showing signs of life. If we were doing this in the preseason, Shawn, maybe he doesn't make the opening 2 rounds. Dontavian Wicks, Zach Charbonnet, and then Sean Kendry Miller is eventually going to get his opportunity. He's at the back end at the 212. But going through that, you can see the talent from last year. There's a lot of viable fantasy names in there. Obviously, the talking point here, I think, versus the 2024 classes, I think the top 3 names there, bring some life to the running back position over the coming couple of years. When we look back at these classes, you can see where, the positions gain strength, or maybe the years that they really struggled to refill some of the players who lost production. But the running backs and the wide receivers, particularly in the 2023 class in that first round, there's a lot of interesting names in there.
And this class fairly strongly illustrates a couple of key principles. One, that you really want to stay away from constantly elevating the QBs and thinking that that's the way to play it. The second one is...
That's a good point to make now, Shawn, because when we get to draft season again, every draft season, and no matter if the class is talked about as not being a great QB class, when you get to, dynasty rookie draft season, there's always going to be a couple of those QBs up at the top end. And realistically, with even these 2 different years, you see how quickly that can change. It feels like a safe bet at the time, but that's definitely not always the case.
It's definitely not. And Bjorn Yang Barnett wrote a fantastic piece, I believe, a year ago, looking at this combination of startup drafts and rookie drafts and what it meant and how you needed to approach the different positions. The other element that I think becomes very clear when you work through a decade is that, especially in rookie drafts, you want to stay away from the idea of thinking that structural drafting is going to deliver a lot of value. In fact, structural drafting in dynasty rookie drafts will probably hurt you pretty badly. The opposite may be true in startups. And one of the things that Bjorn was talking about there is that the difficulty of drafting rookie QBs and making that work really pushes you to make sure you address the position in the startup and you have that foundation. Now, a lot of listeners will know from our dynasty shows that I'm a little bit more willing to push QB even in the startup draft and to try and hit on some of these guys when the prices compared to the established QBs are just so incredibly discounted, right? But that's looking at it from a startup perspective of how much do the stars cost? Where can we find the discounts? Can we layer these things in as we go through? But one of the things that's absolutely crucial is that you can't wait on QB in the startup draft and then think you're going to start just drafting a bunch of QBs in the rookie draft. If you are going to wait on the QBs in the startup draft, in part that's because your global philosophy for attacking Superflex is to be a little bit lighter at QB than maybe some other managers are going to be. And you're going to make that work from a holistic perspective that doesn't then require you to just go and draft QB, because that's going to be throwing a ton of value away. At least historically, that's been the case. And you look at this draft where Bryce Young and Anthony Richardson were the 2 trendiest players. They could still rehabilitate a decent amount of their value, right? We may be at their low point for the next 3 or 4 years. Richardson could go out this next week, have a good game, rip off some strong performances, move way back up. Bryce Young probably doesn't have any ceiling, but if he can establish himself as the Carolina Panthers starter, he will move back up. And yet one of the things that I just don't think there's any way around the fact that right now those 2 guys are buried in the second round. And they're buried in the second round of a class that is good, not great. We'll see if this class rises. Certainly if Anthony Richardson becomes what his enthusiasts hope, then the 2023 class is going to jump maybe even to number 1, because this class with Jahmyr Gibbs at the 103. Colm, Jahmyr Gibbs is somebody we consistently discuss as the best reality running back in football. And he's the 103 because Bijan Robinson is probably the best fantasy back in all of football. Devon Achane may be number 2. The way that his profile has developed in 2024, where he's getting so much receiving work, he's the next guy who can kind of be that David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell type of EP double-double player. He's the guy who could be sort of the next Alvin Kamara or Marshall Faulk type of player. We're in the midst of that transition. He's had some games with a lot of receptions. A little bit of what's happening right now is probably the Tyreek Hill is so far below 100%. But you could certainly see a season where they come out next year where there's a little bit less pressure to play some of the other backs, where Tua stays healthier, where Achane is healthy, where you have the receivers forcing the defense to account for them, and Achane is back to ripping off the big plays while he's also catching 6 to 8 passes a game. He's going to score 23 points a game if that's the case. And that's maybe toward the high end, but it's very reasonable to think that he could do that. Colm, one of the things that happens as you go through these classes, and one of the reasons that the more recent classes can still, rocket up or slide down the rankings, is that their guys are still in the early going. If I had done this exercise in the offseason, Puka Nacua, who's at 104, and Sam Laporta, who's at 109, would have been the 101 and 102. So you work through that, and a lot is still going to happen. But Sam Laporta, the best rookie year at tight end ever, sitting there in a situation where he's been kind of covered up by the other weapons that Detroit has. You think about the guys who are ahead of him. Nacua, all-time great rookie season at wide receiver. Jayden Reed, electric wide receiver, and the probable long-term number 1 for a juggernaut in the Green Bay Packers. Zay Flowers, same thing, and a juggernaut for the Baltimore Ravens. Rashee Rice, same thing, and what you hope will end up being eventually, again, a juggernaut for the Kansas City Chiefs. And then CJ Stroud, who had a fantastic rookie season, and now we don't know. 2024 has been very bleak. But you look at Laporta, and then you finish out that rookie first round with Jaxon Smith Njigba, Josh Downs, and Tank Dell. The reason this class doesn't rank a little bit higher is simply because the QBs have been so disappointing. But even as we go through it here, I think the 2023 class is going to rise. Looking at it one-to-one, I may even have to make some adjustments before we go to publication. Where are you with this class versus the current 2024 class?
The first thing I wanted to say was when you combine the two classes together, it's very positive for the future of the NFL, the future of fantasy in terms of the playmakers that have come in. The other part I wanted to mention is I mentioned like Quentin Johnson and, coming into the season, how we looked, or even Cedric Tillman, how we would have looked at him coming into the season. The picture has obviously changed. But when we look at the 2024 class, and don't want to put this out there really, but Xavier Worthy, if his season continues in the vein that it currently is, he starts to move his way down to a Quentin Johnson kind of rookie season at that particular point, or he could end up at the back end of round 2 if his season continues in that form. And the same with the likes of Roma Dunze, they can slide. So I think there's always that optimistic eye on the rookie class as it moves forward. So like even in 12 months, these two classes I could see flipping places. Potentially the top end of this class is just so strong. When we look, Shawn, through the list of names here, I do think more so than last year's class, there's some of these names that could be tethered together. The like of CJ Stroud and Tank Dell. Stroud takes a real leap forward here towards the end of the season. Maybe that's involving a player who looked, I thought, healthier in week 10, and Tank Dell. Similarly with the likes of Anthony Richardson, I think his value with Josh Downs has tethered that bit as well. And it has been, people have been kind of wanting Flacco to be in there for Downs' upside, but ideally for the franchise, it's those two guys clicking together would be the way to look at it. But I think if Richardson comes in and is looking really good, putting up a lot of fantasy points, particularly if he's having some touchdown passes and they're going to Downs, I think they could both be paired together. But it's hard to argue with those top 7 picks in the order. And then you're looking at the picks after that are Stroud and Laporta. So very, very strong. And hopefully we see, some consistency here from JSN that would also push him up into the higher end of this picture. But it's going to be tough to knock those top 7 guys out of those spots moving forward. Shawn, let's talk about the 101 of rookie classes. That's the 2017 class. I'll run through the class. I'll let you pick out some of your favorite names. But a lot of consistency, a lot of high scoring, and then players who have played in the league for a long, long time. So starts off Patrick Mahomes, Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, Cooper Kupp, Austin Eckler, George Kittle, Aaron Jones, Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Deshaun Watson, Chris Godwin, James Conner making up the first 12 picks, and then Juju Smith-Schuster, Kareem Hunt, Leonard Fournette, Evan Ingram, David Njoku, Mike Williams, Kenny Golladay, Curtis Samuel, Chris Carson, Tyreek Cohen, Jamal Williams, and Corey Davis. So some of those names, obviously come in with more fanfare, the likes of Corey Davis, and finishes at the back of the second round. But particularly that first round, Shawn, is just absolutely loaded with talent. Then you get the tight ends and Evan Ingram, who had 100 reception season last year, I believe. It feels like that was years ago, Shawn, with him missing time this season. But then David Njoku, who kind of had his breakout year last year as well. So depth at the tight end position for a rookie class. But the running backs, Shawn, in that 2017 class are where the true domination was. There is 7 names in those top 12 for the RBs.
This class was extraordinary. You get the GOAT at QB, and obviously whether or not we can still call him that has been the topic of several of our recent shows. But what Patrick Mahomes has done early in his career is absolutely astonishing. A lot of that is from a reality perspective, but he has some massive fantasy seasons in there as well. Then you get probably the 2 most valuable running backs of the decade in Christian McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara. You get
I think we'll have people arguing with the show at the moment that Christian McCaffrey should be the 101 here. But then I guess he has missed multiple seasons with long-term injuries. But I feel like if you look at this period of time, he may be the 101 of fantasy players.
Yeah, and that's what the write-up says, that he's been a fantasy force that harkens back to the days of Marshall Faulk and Priest Holmes, LaDainian Tomlinson. But the injuries do matter. And, Patrick Mahomes, so bizarre that he's still startable, obviously, as super flex, but not startable in regular redraft this year. Hard to fathom. But he's been the overall QB1 a couple times. He's got 3 additional top 6 seasons, and it would be shocking if he doesn't do that for another decade. That's one of the reasons that fantasy managers get so caught up in drafting these elite QBs as they're looking at the longevity. It appears that Mahomes will have a much longer peak than McCaffrey. We'll see if that ends up being the case. Alvin Kamara certainly has an argument to be the 101 in this group. But, you look at the 104 and Cooper Kupp's 440-point season in 2021. That's a record that's... we right now have Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. You've got guys like Malik Neighbors and maybe Marvin Harrison. You have someone in a CD Lamb. The 440 points, how many times the Jamar Chase, especially if they're going to not participate in the first month of the year, like how many times he would need to hit 55 in order to legitimately or realistically challenge 440. So we'll see if that's a record that can never be broken. We obviously have some very good receivers in the NFL. Unfortunately, most of them don't have great quarterbacks right now. That's the thing that really separates Chase. But going back through, it was shocking to me, even though, we experienced it, we rode the wave. Austin Eckler was a 0 RB candidate for many years. Surprising how many peak seasons. He has had 3 over 300. George Kittle has 5 seasons as a high-end tight end 1, and it looks like he's going to be the overall tight end 1 this year. Aaron Jones averaged over 250 points a game across 2019 to 2023. Dalvin Cook I mean, he's going to be controversial, a little bit of a shorter peak there, but he scored 640 points in just 28 games across 2019 to 2020.
He burned bright.
He did. He did.
It's kind of like, Todd Gurley had something like just historic performances, but the fuse just wasn't long enough.
Joe Mixon kind of the opposite, where he's burned dimly but successfully for a long time. He's got 5 200-point seasons. You have Deshaun Watson in there, who I may even move down a little bit before publication, but he had a very strong early peak before the disgrace and the collapse. You have Chris Godwin was the overall wide receiver 2 in 2019. It's been a healthy lock for 200 points basically his entire career. James Conner has done more, I think, than people realize. 4 200-point seasons. And then in the second round, you've got guys like Kareem Hunt, Leonard Fournette. I mean, Fournette gets all the crap for being bad at everything, but still having that season with Tom Brady at the end. But he also, did some things back at Jacksonville before they soured on him. And then you've got these two, probably not elite, but very plus tight ends who are buried in the middle of the second round. Colm, this class is crazy. But the craziest thing about it is that the 2017 class is my number one. Certainly there's some competition. There are classes behind them that have both Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. There are classes behind them that have Justin Jefferson and 5 QB hits. And when we talk about how many times the QBs have missed, the number 2 ranked class has 5 QB hits. So there's competition for this top spot, which I think makes it even crazier to think that NFL GMs didn't know who the stars were going to be. And that's the other big takeaway. And again, none of this is new or anything like that, but going through this type of exercise and refamiliarizing yourself with all of the players, thinking through the classes, thinking through how the last decade has developed, you're like, okay, the best class of the decade had Mitchell Trubisky as the first quarterback drafted. It had Leonard Fournette as the first running back drafted. And even though he was okay as a professional, he doesn't end up in the first round of the reselection exercise. Corey Davis is the first wide receiver drafted. And then it's not just that at receiver, but Mike Williams is the second receiver drafted. John Ross is the third receiver drafted. Zay Jones is the fourth receiver drafted. Curtis Samuel is the fifth receiver drafted. The class that I have ranked number 1, the first 5 wide receivers were busts. The first 5.
You could say that this here was the worst wide receiver NFL draft class in history, if you want to rank it that way as well, because there's a huge amount of misses. The other players, Shawn, we talked about the tight ends. O.J. Howard was selected at 19 in that draft, and there's some of those names that we've gone through there. There's plays and flashes, and Mike Williams did have a season with the Chargers there where it looked like he was about to break out, and then had the injury. There's a lot of those names, that it's a couple of flashes and really they were busts. So for the class to still go on and have that high upside talent, and when you go through some of the numbers that you mentioned, like people who are listening, and I'm sure they all have memories of some sort of historic event that those players, charged them to a title. For example, I can't remember if it was Christmas Day or Christmas Eve a few years ago, Shawn, the Alvin Kamara 6-touchdown game. There's a lot of days in there the likes of Cooper Kupp would have had, but you mentioned Austin Eckler, lots of big scoring numbers from him, and we know obviously Christian McCaffrey. So this class has produced a lot of fantasy memories over those last couple of years. And even, when you look at when these players came in, the likes of a James Conner drafted into the Pittsburgh Steelers with Le'Veon Bell. I believe he was a rookie on that holdout season. Is that correct, Shawn?
Second year.
And that's where the breakout then occurs, obviously, and then eventually ends up with the Cardinals and has kind of, I don't know if it's fair to call it a renaissance, but he is he's going really, really strong in 2024 as we move forward. Shawn, I think this is a fun exercise. I would recommend that people go and check out all the 10 teams. Maybe they even pick up on some of the alterations that you may make between now and time of publication. Any other thoughts on the process or any of the classes we talked about that you wanted to share?
Well, you're talking about sort of the memories and the high points, and mentioning that this class was one of the weakest at receiver and yet still makes it through. That's another point to where you want to go where the value is in any particular draft, and you want your perpetually reloaded team to be able to take advantage of any position, right? So by getting a lot of picks and by building a lot of depth, you're not going to be drafting for need, and you're going to be able to load up on the situations that are exploitable or are valuable in that draft. But the player who comes in this number one ranked class at the 201, whom we haven't mentioned, and his career went in such a direction that certainly, even people who have joined fantasy in the last few years, they may have an extremely negative view of Juju Smith-Schuster, but he had one of the most extraordinary starts to a career of any receiver over the first couple of years. When you consider how young he was.
He overtook Antonio Brown, Shawn, who was the wide receiver.
Yeah, so we're talking about a guy who unfortunately did lose most of the rest of his career to injury. But yeah, with those early receivers going down, you still get Cooper Kupp, you still get Juju Smith-Schuster, you still get Chris Godwin. Such a fun 2017 class, Colm. As we mentioned, I mean, it was tough to rank and it was fun to rank. That's one of the things that makes it exciting, is that it's not super easy just to fill all of these guys in. I mean, there's a class here with Tyreek Hill and Derrick Henry at 1 and 2. You've got a class in 2022 that I think even 3 years in is difficult to rank because so many of those players are still controversial in season 3.
Shawn, the number 8 ranked team or 8 ranked group starts off with Jamar Chase and Amon-Ra St. Brown, followed by Nico Collins. Top 3 players. There's a lot of good players that have been drafted, which is, again, good for fantasy. But yeah, it's fun to go through them and see the depth or lack of depth in some of the years. So not only are the years ranked in order of 1 to 10, then you get the first and second round by ADP, according to if Shawn was redrafting these again. So I think great stuff to check out. I will, if it is published by the time this is posted, put a link in the show notes. If not, check it up on rotoviz.com. If you want to sign up over at RotoViz, you can get a 10% discount off your 1-year pass using the code RVRadio2024 at checkout. Get you access to all of the tools and content. And Shawn, we have a special 3-month offer on at the moment. Do you want to let the listeners know about it?
Yeah, it's heavily discounted so that you can get some fun pieces like this, so that you can make the push to win your 2024 fantasy title. Things like Blair's Wrong Read series, that preview article every week that goes through all of the advanced stats and the matchups for every team. You have things like Dave Cabin's wide receiver cornerback article that uses the passing matchup rater. That's so crucial for making the right start to sit decisions and playing the wide range of weekly fantasy contests that are out there. You have great pieces by Neil and Ross looking at how you want to stream some of the more difficult positions. We've got all of the great work every week from Kevin. He has you covered on so many different things, including waivers and wide receivers. Colm, the Strength of Schedule streamer is fantastic for building those trades as we head to the FFPC Dynasty trade deadline, as we head toward the Dynasty trade deadline in all of people's individual leagues and all of the sites that you are on. Super cheap. Come get that. The tools and the content will help you win now and win later. We've been excited about how successful the 2024 version of the RotoViz Rookie Guide has been. The 2025 version, we hope, will be even better. You can get in on the ground floor by having your 3-month sub through January here. Colin, I'm excited about the rest of the way.
Yeah, let's get ready for week 11. Hopefully everyone gets the wins or the high scores that they want, whether that's redraft, dynasty, or best ball. We are closing in on the time of the year where every single one of those points will matter and get you into the playoffs or get you into contention. That is going to do it for this edition of RotoViz OT. Hopefully more touchdowns in week 11 than week 10. We don't have to talk about week 10 anymore. Don't worry, I'm not tilted about week 10. It was all fine. We're on to week 11. Enjoy it. Let's move forward and have a good one.